My name is Elena Carter. I am 32 years old. 2 weeks ago, my parents told the entire family I had been sent to a rehabilitation center after a breakdown. The truth was far simpler and far more dangerous to them than any addiction story they could invent. I was not in rehab. I was building something they never believed I was capable of building, and on the morning everything started to collapse, Forbes called my private number. I still remember the exact moment I found out what they had done. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that feels harmless until it isn't. I was sitting at my small apartment desk, reviewing investor notes, when my cousin's message appeared on my phone. Just 4 words. "Are you okay, Elena?" I didn't understand it at first. Then another message came. Then another. Within 10 minutes, my phone was flooding with notifications from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. "I heard you checked into rehab. I'm praying for your recovery. Why didn't you tell anyone?" My hands went cold before my mind fully caught up. I had not told anyone I was sick. I had not told anyone I was missing. I had not told anyone anything because there was nothing to tell. But my parents had. And they had done it with precision. I opened a family group chat I had muted years ago. What I saw there didn't feel real at first. My mother had written it in a calm, sympathetic tone, the kind people use when they want to sound like victims while destroying someone else. "Elena has been struggling for a long time. We made the difficult decision to send her into treatment. We ask for privacy and prayers during this time." No mention of discussion. No mention of truth. No mention of me. Just a story designed to replace me. I stared at the screen for a long time, waiting for anger to arrive first. But what came instead was something quieter. Calculation. Because I knew exactly why they had done it. They could not control what I was building anymore. I was not the daughter they had expected to fail quietly. I had started something 2 years ago from nothing. A consulting and data infrastructure platform built in silence, late nights, borrowed time, and relationships they had always dismissed as irrelevant people. Engineers, analysts, early-stage founders who never cared about family reputation or social image. And it was working. Too well. But my parents had always preferred a different version of me. The version that needed saving. The version that asked permission. The version that failed in predictable ways so they could feel useful. I had stopped being that version a long time ago. The first time I realized I had become a problem for them was 6 months earlier, at a family dinner I almost didn't attend. My father had looked at me across the table, not with anger, but with something colder. Disappointment mixed with calculation. "So what exactly are you doing again?" he asked. I told him the truth in simple terms. Data systems. Enterprise solutions. Early traction with private clients. He nodded slowly as if listening, but I could see it in his eyes. He had already decided not to believe me. My mother changed the subject within seconds. That was the moment I understood something important. They were not confused about my success. They were threatened by it. Because success without their approval meant loss of control. And control had always been the real currency in our family. I didn't respond to the messages. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and checked my email inbox. There it was. A subject line I almost missed at first glance. Forbes inquiry. Feature interview request. I read it once. Then again. The timing was almost absurd. While my family was rewriting my identity as a broken woman in recovery, one of the most influential business publications in the world was asking for my story under my real name, tied to my actual company, with verified revenue figures and growth data I had never shared publicly. My phone rang before I could process it fully. Unknown number. I answered. "Ms. Carter," a calm voice said. "This is Daniel Reeves from Forbes editorial. Is now a bad time?" I looked at the messages still flooding my screen. Rehab. Prayer. Concern. Lies. "No," I said quietly. "Now is fine." There was a pause on the other end, as if he could sense something unusual in my tone. "We've been following your work for some time," he continued. "Your platform has been flagged internally as one of the fastest-growing private infrastructure solutions in your sector. We'd like to feature your journey." Journey. They always used that word when they didn't yet know the full story. "I see," I said. "We also understand," he added carefully, "that you prefer to stay relatively private. However, given your recent expansion into 3 new enterprise contracts, we believe visibility could be strategically beneficial." 3 new contracts. My parents didn't know about those either. No one in my family did. Because I had stopped sharing my life with people who only listened for opportunities to diminish it. After I ended the call, I sat in silence for a long time. Outside my window, the city moved like nothing had changed. Cars, lights, ordinary lives continuing without interruption. But inside my phone, my entire identity had been rewritten by people who thought they knew me. A woman in rehab. A broken daughter. A cautionary story whispered at family gatherings. I opened the family group chat again. Another message had appeared from my aunt. "We're here for you, sweetheart. Stay strong. Your parents are doing what's best." Doing what's best. I almost laughed, but it didn't come out. Because what they had actually done was not protect anyone. They had just made a mistake they didn't yet understand. And mistakes like this have consequences they cannot control. I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked to the window. For the first time that day, I allowed myself to say it out loud. "They didn't send me to rehab," I whispered. "They tried to erase me." And somewhere, deep in my inbox, the Forbes email was still waiting for my reply. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the messages again. Not just the words, but the intention behind them. My parents hadn't simply lied. They had built a version of me that made sense to them. A version that justified their distance, their dismissiveness, their constant underestimation. A daughter in rehab was easier to explain than a daughter who had quietly become successful without them. At 3:12 a.m., my phone lit up again. This time it was a text from my mother. "We didn't want things to go this way. You left us no choice. People were asking questions. We had to say something. No choice." That phrase had followed me my entire life. No choice when they compared me to my cousins. No choice when they forgot my achievements. No choice when they never showed up to anything that mattered to me. But this was different. This was not neglect. This was construction. They had actively built a lie and spread it through the entire family network. I placed the phone face down and stared at the ceiling. My life did not begin with the company. It began long before that. I was 6 the first time I understood I was not the version of a daughter they wanted. It happened at my cousin's birthday party. There were balloons, loud music, and a camera my aunt kept pointing at every moment like she was collecting evidence of happiness. I remember standing near the wall in a yellow dress my mother had picked out. She had told me to behave, to smile, to not interrupt. My cousin was opening gifts in the center of the room. Every box came with applause. Every reaction was recorded. When it was my turn months later, there was no party. Just dinner. Just a small cake. No photos that I remember anyone printing. But I remember something else more clearly than anything else. My mother saying almost casually, "We don't need to make everything about her." Her. Not my name. Just a category. That was the beginning. Years passed in that pattern. Not loud cruelty. Not obvious rejection. Something more dangerous. Consistent minimization. When I brought home top grades, my father nodded without looking up from his phone. When I won a regional academic award, my mother said, "That's nice," and asked what was for dinner. When I got accepted into a competitive program in university, my uncle said, "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Every milestone was absorbed and flattened. Nothing was ever allowed to become significant. But something strange happens when you are repeatedly told your life is ordinary while you are actively living something extraordinary. You stop trying to prove it to them. And you start building without them. I didn't plan my company as revenge. Not at first. It started as curiosity. A problem I couldn't stop thinking about. Why did so many small businesses fail not because of bad ideas, but because of invisible infrastructure gaps? Data flow issues. Systems inefficiencies. Decisions made too late because information arrived too slowly. I started building tools to fix that. At first, it was just me. My laptop. Long nights. Coffee that went cold before I remembered it existed. Then came the first client. Then the second. Then a pattern. The work was real. But I never told my family. Because every time I had shared something meaningful in the past, it had been reduced, redirected, or quietly ignored. So I stopped offering them access. That was 2 years ago. And in that silence, something dangerous happened. I became good. Then I became necessary. Then I became someone people paid attention to without needing permission from my family first. At 6:41 a.m., my phone rang again. This time I answered immediately. "Elena," Daniel from Forbes said, "we've confirmed additional data from your company's recent contracts. The board is very interested in moving quickly on this feature. Are you available to meet this week?" I looked at my reflection in the dark window. A woman my family had just described as unstable. A woman an entire publication was now calling strategically important. "Yes," I said, "but there's something you should know first." There was a pause. "I'm listening," he said. "My family believes I'm in rehab." Silence. Not disbelief. Not confusion. Just professional recalibration. "Do they know where you are currently?" he asked carefully. "No," I said. And that's the problem. After I ended the call, I finally stood up and walked to my desk. The messages were still coming in. Concern. Sympathy. False grief. But now something had changed. Because I wasn't just reacting to a lie anymore. I was watching a system reveal itself. And systems don't collapse because you get angry at them. They collapse when truth enters places they cannot control. I opened my laptop again. The Forbes email was still there. This time, I clicked reply. I hit send before I could overthink it. "Yes, I'm available. And I'll agree to the feature under one condition. The story is accurate, unfiltered, and tied to verified public records only." Daniel's reply came back within minutes. "Understood. That's exactly why we want you." I closed the laptop and sat in silence for a moment that felt heavier than it should have. Because once that email was sent, something irreversible had begun. Not just in my career, but in the way my life would now be seen by people who had never cared enough to look at it properly before. At 9:18 a.m., I finally got out of my apartment. The city outside felt unchanged, but I felt different inside it. Every ordinary thing now carried a second layer of meaning. People walking to work. Phones ringing. Conversations happening in cafes. All of it continued as if nothing in my personal life had just shifted into something irreversible. My first stop was the office space I rented under the company name my family still didn't fully understand. It wasn't flashy. No glass towers. No branding on the walls. Just a functional space with whiteboards, quiet rooms, and the kind of atmosphere where people came to solve problems, not perform success. Inside, my team was already working. No one asked me about family. No one asked me about personal life. That was the unspoken rule I had built from day one. We talked in metrics, not memories. "Morning," I said, placing my bag down. A quiet nod from Aaron, my lead systems architect. A brief smile from Mira, who handled client infrastructure. Everything normal. Everything stable. Except me. I pulled up the internal dashboard. 3 enterprise contracts were active. 2 more in final negotiation. Growth steady. No volatility. No warning signs. This was the reality my parents had never bothered to see. Or worse, had chosen not to believe. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. I didn't answer immediately. I stared at his name until the vibration stopped. Then it rang again. I stepped into a quiet room and answered. "Elena," his voice came through, controlled but sharp. "What is going on with you?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "We heard something unusual." Just accusation, already formed. "I think you know," I said calmly. A pause. "Your mother is being contacted by people asking questions," he continued. "Family members are confused. Some are upset. Why would you let them think something like this?" "Let them think," I repeated quietly. "Yes. This rehab story. It's humiliating for all of us. All of us." That was interesting. Because none of it had been done by me. "I didn't tell anyone I was in rehab," I said. Another pause, shorter this time. "You should have clarified sooner," he replied. I almost laughed. Clarified. As if lies become truth when left unchallenged long enough. "You didn't call to ask if I was okay," I said. "You called because people are asking questions about you." That landed differently. I could hear it in his breathing. The shift. The recalculation. "This is not about us," he said finally. But it was. It had always been about them. Their image. Their narrative. Their control over how the family interpreted reality. "I'm not in rehab," I said again, slower this time. "I never was." Silence stretched between us. Then my father said something that stayed with me longer than anything else that day. "Then where have you been?" Not curiosity. Not concern. Control disguised as geography. "I've been building something," I said. "That doesn't answer the question." "It does," I replied. "You just don't like the answer." I ended the call before he could respond. My hands were steady, but something inside me had shifted. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was just stating what was true. Back in the main office, Mira looked up from her screen. "Everything okay?" I paused for a second. A normal question. Innocent. Routine. But the answer wasn't simple anymore. "Yes," I said. "Everything is becoming clear." She nodded and went back to work. At 3:02 p.m., Daniel from Forbes sent a follow-up email. "We've completed initial verification. There's significant interest from readers. We'd like to proceed with a full narrative draft based on your timeline. Please confirm access to any supporting materials you're comfortable sharing." Timeline. That word again. As if my life was something that could be structured neatly into a sequence of explainable events. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Because if I agreed to this fully, there would be no partial visibility anymore. My family would not just have told a story. They would be confronted with the fact that the story had been wrong. And worse for them, it would be public. At 4:11 p.m., my phone lit up again. This time it was my cousin. "Is it true?" she asked. That was all. No greeting. No context. Just pressure. I stared at the message for a long time. Because now the lie was doing something interesting. It wasn't just spreading. It was collapsing under its own weight. And I was no longer inside it. I was outside, watching it break. I opened the Forbes email again. And this time, I began attaching the first set of documents. I attached the first file without hesitation. It was strange how simple it looked on screen. Just a document upload. A quiet action with consequences I could already feel forming in the background, even though nothing visible had changed yet. Within minutes, Daniel replied. "Received. This is stronger than expected." Stronger than expected. I read that line twice. Because what they had been expecting was not me. It was a narrative. A correction of a rumor. Not a structural collapse of a family-built illusion. I leaned forward in my chair and opened the second file. Revenue reports. Contract summaries. Internal growth metrics. Nothing dramatic in appearance, but everything precise. The kind of data that does not argue. It simply exists. At 5:08 p.m., my lead engineer walked in. He didn't usually interrupt me. Something in his expression told me he had seen something outside our walls. "Are you aware," he said carefully, "that your name is circulating in a private investor thread?" I looked up. "No," I said. He placed his phone on the table. A screenshot was open. My name. My company name. And a line beneath it. Founder allegedly in rehab. Company operating under interim oversight. I stared at it. So it had already begun outside the family. Not just gossip now. Market noise. Perception shift. The moment where fiction starts behaving like fact because enough people repeat it without verification. "Who posted this?" I asked. He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. It's spreading." That was the problem. Rumors don't need origin once they gain momentum. They only need repetition. I picked up the phone and sent a single message to Daniel. "It has started to leak. I want the feature moved up." His reply came almost immediately. "Understood. We'll fast-track editorial review." Fast-track. A polite way of saying, this is now a controlled response, not just a story. I closed my eyes for a moment. Because now there were two versions of me existing at the same time. One built by my family. One being verified by institutions. And the gap between them was widening fast. At 6:22 p.m., I got another call. My mother. I answered this time. Her voice was different. Not confident. Not rehearsed. Controlled panic disguised as concern. "Elena," she said quickly, "people are asking questions. Why is your name being mentioned in business circles? And why are they saying you're not in rehab?" So they had seen it. Or at least parts of it. "I'm not in rehab," I said again. A pause. "That's not what we told them," she said quietly. That sentence landed differently than the others. Because it wasn't accusation. It was exposure. "You told them I was sick," I replied. "We were trying to protect you," she said immediately. There it was again. Protect. That word they used when they meant control. From what? I asked. From judgment. From pressure. From questions you weren't ready to answer. I almost laughed again. Because I had been answering questions for years. Just not the ones they wanted. "I've been answering questions," I said. "Just not to you." Silence. Longer this time. Then she said something softer. "Why didn't you tell us what you were building?" There it was. The real question. Not about my health. Not about concern. About exclusion. About being left out of something they believed they should have had authority over. "Because you never asked in a way that made it feel safe to tell you," I said. She didn't respond. And I could hear something in the background. Voices. Movement. A family environment reacting to instability. "People are talking," she said finally. "Yes," I replied. "They are. And what are you going to do about it?" That question again. As if I was responsible for fixing the consequences of their decision. "I'm not going to do anything," I said. That confused her. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm not going to stop the truth from reaching people who already decided they wanted a story." There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "Elena." But I ended the call. Because something else had just arrived. A notification. Forbes editorial confirmation. Draft ready for final approval. I opened it immediately. And for the first time, I saw my life written by someone who had never been inside my family system, but had understood the structure of what had happened better than anyone inside it ever had. No rehab. No breakdown. No disappearance. Just a timeline of construction. Late nights. Early clients. Scaling infrastructure. Quiet growth that outpaced visibility. And one final line near the end of the draft. While her family publicly believed she was in rehabilitation, Carter was actively negotiating multi-million-dollar enterprise contracts under a private operational structure. I stared at that sentence. Because that was the moment the two worlds officially collided. Not emotionally. Not socially. Structurally. At 7:41 p.m., my cousin called. I didn't answer. Then my uncle. Then another relative. Calls stacked like pressure building in a sealed system. And I let them all go unanswered. Because for the first time, I understood something clearly. They didn't want truth. They wanted control of the narrative before it escaped them completely. But it already had. At 8:15 p.m., Daniel sent one final message. We're going live tomorrow morning. I set the phone down slowly. Outside the office windows, the city lights were coming on one by one. And somewhere, in homes I would never enter, people were already discussing a version of me that had been carefully constructed without my input. But that version was about to meet the real one. And neither of them would survive the collision unchanged. I didn't go home that night. I stayed in the office after everyone left, sitting in the same chair, watching the city through the glass like it belonged to someone else. The lights outside kept shifting, cars moving in patterns that felt normal to everyone except me. Because I knew tomorrow morning wasn't just a publication. It was exposure. At 10:03 p.m., my phone lit up again. This time, it wasn't a relative. It was an unknown number. I answered. A man's voice came through, calm but direct. Ms. Carter. Yes. This is Jonathan Hale from Hale and Mercer Legal Advisory. The name made me pause. I had heard of them before. Not in casual contexts. In corporate disputes. High-profile restructures. Quiet legal demolitions of reputations that no longer served their owners. I understand Forbes is running a feature on you, he continued. Yes, I said cautiously. We've been contacted by a third party representing your family, he said. They are requesting clarification regarding public statements about your mental health status. There it was. They had moved it beyond family. Into legal framing. They're claiming I was in rehab? I asked. Yes, he said. And they are presenting it as a wellness matter that has been misrepresented. Misrepresented. A soft word for a deliberate fabrication. I was never in rehab, I said. I understand, he replied. However, they are attempting to establish a narrative of incapacity. It may affect how tomorrow's publication is received in certain circles. Certain circles. He meant investors, partners, people who didn't care about truth as much as they cared about risk. So what are you telling me? I asked. There was a brief pause. I'm telling you, he said carefully, that your family is not just reacting emotionally. They are attempting to preemptively neutralize the credibility of your public emergence. Neutralize. That word stayed in my head after the call ended, because it confirmed something I already knew but had not yet fully accepted. This was no longer just family conflict. It was a containment attempt. At 11:26 p.m., I opened my laptop again. The Forbes draft was still sitting there, waiting for final approval. But now I hesitated. Not because it was inaccurate. Because I understood what would happen after it went live. There would be no quiet correction. No private reconciliation. No fading back into normal family dynamics. Once the article published, there would only be two versions of my life. The one they tried to write. And the one the world would now see. At 11:58 p.m., my phone rang again. My father. I answered. Elena, he said immediately, no greeting, no softness. We need to talk before this goes any further. It's already going further, I replied. You're letting this get out of control, he said. This Forbes thing. These rumors. Do you understand what people are saying about us? There it was again. Us. Not me. Not the truth. We are trying to manage a situation that is spiraling, he continued. And your silence is making it worse. My silence. I repeated. Yes. If you had corrected this earlier. Corrected what? I interrupted. A story you created? A pause. Then his tone shifted. Lower. More controlled. You are making a mistake, he said. You think visibility is power. It isn't. Reputation is power. And once that is damaged, it doesn't matter what you've built. I stood up slowly, walked to the window, looked at the city again. You're wrong, I said quietly. What did you say? I said you're wrong. Another pause. And I could hear it now. Not anger. Fear. Because something was slipping beyond his influence. You don't understand what this will do to the family, he said. I understand exactly what it will do, I replied. It will reveal what you've been saying about me when I'm not in the room. Silence. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Because denial would require honesty first. At 12:14 a.m., I finally hung up. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief. Not anger. Clarity. Because I could now see the full structure of what had been happening. This wasn't a single lie. It was a system of reinforcement. Every relative repeating it. Every conversation strengthening it. Every assumption building it into something that felt real to them. And the truth wasn't going to break it gently. It was going to replace it. At 6:41 a.m., the Forbes article went live. I didn't refresh the page immediately. I just sat there, letting the silence hold for a few seconds before I clicked it. The headline was simple. From invisible to infrastructure. How Elena Carter built a multi-million-dollar systems company while the world looked away. I read the first paragraph slowly. Then the second. Then I stopped reading entirely. Because I could already feel the shift happening. Not in me. Outside me. Messages began appearing again. But this time they were different. Confused. Reversing. Re-evaluating. I just read the article. Is this true? Wait, she's not in rehab. This can't be the same Elena we heard about. Then came the silence from the people who had been spreading the other version. That silence was louder than anything else. At 7:19 a.m., my cousin texted again. I think we were told the wrong thing. I didn't reply. Because I realized something important. They didn't need my explanation anymore. The structure had already corrected itself. At 8:03 a.m., my phone rang. My mother again. I answered. But I didn't speak first. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, quietly, why didn't you tell us? Not accusation this time. Not control. Confusion mixed with collapse. I looked at the Forbes article still open on my screen. And I finally said the truth out loud. Because you only started listening when other people did. Silence. Longer than before. Heavier. And then, for the first time, she didn't argue. She didn't correct. She didn't redirect. She just said, I didn't know. And I believed her. But belief doesn't repair structure. It only acknowledges damage. I ended the call. And sat back. Because the story was no longer about whether they understood me. It was about what remained after understanding arrived too late. I didn't feel relief the next morning. That surprised me. I thought I would. Instead, I felt something closer to weight settling into place. Like the world had finally stopped pretending and was now adjusting itself to what was real. The Forbes article had already moved beyond its initial audience. I could see it in the analytics dashboard, not because I was tracking attention, but because the attention was now impossible to ignore. Mentions. shares, screenshots. And then something more uncomfortable. Recognition. People from my past were resurfacing in the comments, in messages, in quiet admissions that they had known something was off, even if they had never said it out loud. At 9:14 a.m., my team started arriving one by one. No one asked me about the article directly, but they didn't need to. The atmosphere itself had changed. Mira placed her bag down carefully, looked at me and said, "So it's out?" "Yes," I replied. Erin leaned against the table, arms crossed. "We're getting inbound interest already. 2 new enterprise requests this morning." I nodded. That part was expected. What wasn't expected was the shift in how people were talking about me. Not as a founder, not as a technical operator, but as a story. A narrative people could now align themselves with or distance themselves from. At 10:27 a.m., my phone rang again. Unknown number. I answered. A woman's voice, older, hesitant. "Is this Elena?" "Yes." "This is your Aunt Linda." I didn't respond immediately. We hadn't spoken in years. "I just read the article," she continued. "I didn't know any of this." That phrase again. I didn't know. It had become the most common sentence in my life within 12 hours. "I believed what your parents said," she admitted quietly. "We all did. We all did." That was the part that mattered. Not one person. Not a misunderstanding. A collective acceptance of a version of me that was easier to believe than the real one. "I understand," I said. There was a pause. "Are you okay?" she asked finally. It was a simple question. But it didn't feel simple anymore. Because it required me to decide what okay meant in a situation like this. "I'm functioning," I said. Another pause. Then she said something softer. "I think we failed you." I didn't answer. Because I didn't need her to name it. Naming it didn't undo it. At 11:03 a.m., another message came in. This time from my father. I saw the article. That was all. No greeting. No explanation. No framing. Just acknowledgement. I didn't reply immediately. I waited. Because I wanted to see if this was another attempt to regain control of the narrative. At 11:18 a.m., another message followed. "We need to meet." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was afraid of the meeting, but because I understood what it represented. Meetings were where they had always controlled the tone, where silence was pressure, where authority spoke louder than truth. At 12:01 p.m., I replied. "Public or private?" 3 minutes passed. Private. That was expected. Because public meant witnesses. And witnesses meant accountability. At 1:46 p.m., I arrived at the restaurant they had chosen. Not a family home. Not a familiar space. Neutral ground. That itself told me something had already changed. My father was already seated when I arrived. My mother beside him. Neither of them smiled. I sat down. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then my father leaned forward slightly. "You didn't correct us," he said. I looked at him. "I didn't create the story," I replied. My mother's hands tightened slightly around her glass. "We were trying to protect you," she said again. That phrase again. It had become automatic now. A reflex. Like repetition had replaced reflection. "From what?" I asked. My father exhaled slowly. "From exposure," he said. There it was. Honesty, finally, but not the kind they wanted to give. Exposure. Not pain. Not harm. Exposure. "You were building something quietly," he continued. "We didn't understand it. And when people started asking questions, we panicked." We. Again. Always we when responsibility became uncomfortable. "I wasn't hidden," I said calmly. "You just weren't paying attention." That sentence landed heavier than the others. My mother looked down for a moment, then back up. I didn't think it was real, she admitted. That was the closest thing to truth I had heard from her. Not denial. Not defense. Just misjudgment. I know, I said. And that surprised her. Because I didn't say it with anger. At 2:03 p.m., my father spoke again. Do you understand what this has done to us? I paused. That question again. But now it sounded different. Not controlling. Not defensive. But exposed. Yes, I said quietly. It showed people what you were willing to say about me when you thought no one would check. Silence. Longer this time. My mother finally spoke. I didn't think it would go this far. That sentence held everything. The assumption that consequences are optional. That stories can be contained. That people can be reshaped without resistance. You didn't think I would be seen, I said. She didn't respond. Because she couldn't deny it. At 2:19 p.m., I stood up. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just slowly. The way someone leaves a space they no longer belong in emotionally. My father looked up. Elena, he said softer now, we can fix this. I looked at him for a long moment. And I realized something important. He wasn't asking for truth. He was asking for restoration of comfort. I don't think you can fix what you didn't understand you were breaking, I said. Then I walked out. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter. Just honest. My phone buzzed again before I reached the car. Daniel from Forbes. Reactions are escalating. The feature has surpassed projected reach by 400%. We may need a follow-up piece. I stopped walking for a second. Follow-up. As if my life was now a series. As if this was not just exposure, but continuation. I didn't reply immediately. Because I was no longer inside the version of the story they had tried to write. And I was no longer trying to convince anyone I belonged anywhere. The truth had already done that on its own. I didn't go back to the office that evening. Instead, I drove without a fixed destination, letting the city unfold in front of me without trying to assign meaning to it. Traffic lights changed. People crossed streets. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm, completely indifferent to the fact that something in my world had fundamentally shifted. My phone kept vibrating in the passenger seat. I stopped checking after a while. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I realized I no longer needed to react in real time to every version of me other people were constructing. At 5:42 p.m., I parked near the river and sat in silence for a while. This was the first moment all day where no one was asking anything from me. No explanations. No clarifications. No corrections. Just distance. And in that distance, I started noticing something I hadn't had space to see before. The story wasn't just about exposure anymore. It was about redistribution of belief. People who once believed my parents were now questioning everything they had accepted without proof. People who had never known me were now forming opinions based on evidence instead of assumption. And the version of me that had been in rehab was quietly dissolving under the weight of something simpler. Visibility. At 6:18 p.m., my phone lit up again. This time it was a message from an unknown number. I think we need to talk. I was at your cousin's house last month when your name came up. I'm not sure what's true anymore. I stared at it for a moment. Because that sentence captured everything. Not anger. Not accusation. Uncertainty. The collapse of a narrative doesn't always arrive with confrontation. Sometimes it arrives as doubt spreading quietly through the people who once believed they understood everything. I didn't reply. Not because I was avoiding it, but because I was no longer responsible for stabilizing what other people had chosen to believe without checking. At 7:03 p.m., Daniel from Forbes called again. I answered this time. We're seeing sustained engagement, he said. But there's something else developing. What kind of something? I asked. A response narrative, he said carefully. Your family has issued a statement through a private spokesperson. I exhaled slowly. Of course they had. Control never disappears quickly. It adapts. What does it say? I asked. It frames the article as a misunderstanding of your temporary personal struggles, he said. They're emphasizing emotional distress and miscommunication within the family. Temporary personal struggles. A softer version of rehab. A gentler version of disappearance. Not denial anymore. Reframing. They're trying to make it sound like I was unstable, I said. Yes, he replied. But the problem is, the financial documentation contradicts that narrative too strongly. It's not holding in professional circles. Professional circles. That phrase again. The space where perception becomes structured by evidence, not loyalty. I see, I said. There was a pause. Then he added something unexpected. Honestly, your story is now being referenced in internal discussions about founder visibility risk. It's becoming a case study. Case study. That word should have made me uncomfortable. But it didn't. Because I realized something important. I was no longer inside the personal version of this story. I had become the reference point for a structural pattern others were trying to understand. At 8:27 p.m., I finally went back to my apartment. The lights inside felt unfamiliar, like I was entering a space that had existed without me for longer than a day. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't open my laptop. I just sat down. For the first time in nearly 48 hours, there were no active conversations happening around my identity. No immediate pressure to respond. Just silence. And in that silence, something unexpected surfaced. Not anger. Not relief. Grief. Because underneath everything that had happened, there was still the realization that the people closest to me had chosen a version of me that was easier to control over the version that was real. At 9:14 p.m., my phone lit up again. This time it was my mother. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the screen until it stopped ringing. Then a message came through. I don't recognize what this has become. A second message followed. I thought we were protecting you. But I think we were protecting ourselves. I stared at that line for a long time. Because it was the first time she had said anything that wasn't framed as defense. It wasn't an apology. But it was an admission of misalignment. I typed a response, then deleted it. Typed again. Deleted again. Finally, I wrote one sentence. I know. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just acknowledgement that the structure had always been flawed, even if no one had named it out loud until now. At 10:02 p.m., Daniel sent one final message for the day. Tomorrow we may publish the follow-up piece focusing on your company trajectory post-exposure. It's getting significant editorial interest. I set the phone down. Because something had changed again. The story was no longer just about what they said about me. It was about what I had built despite what they believed. And that version of the story didn't depend on their permission anymore. The next morning didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like an afterimage. The kind of silence that follows something loud enough to permanently change how rooms feel even after the sound is gone. I woke up earlier than usual without really intending to. My phone was already on the table beside me, face down, like it had been waiting all night for me to decide whether I still wanted to participate in the version of reality it was holding. I turned it over. Dozens of notifications. But I didn't open them immediately. Because I already knew what they represented now. Reactions. Revisions. People adjusting their understanding of me in real time. At 7:26 a.m., I finally opened my laptop. The follow-up Forbes piece was already scheduled. Not just about me anymore. About the company. About growth under pressure. About what happens when visibility arrives after misrepresentation. It didn't feel like a personal story anymore. It felt like documentation. At 8:11 a.m., I received a message from my father. No greeting. No framing. Just a line. We need to correct the narrative before this becomes permanent. I stared at it for a long moment. Correct the narrative. Even now. Even after everything that had already been verified, published, and cross-checked. There was still this instinct to believe reality could be negotiated. I didn't respond. Because I understood something clearly now. Narratives don't get corrected after evidence arrives. They either collapse or they don't. At 9:03 a.m., I went into the office. This time, something had changed in the way people looked at me. Not dramatically. Not performatively. But subtly. Like awareness had replaced assumption. Mira looked up from her screen and said, "We're getting messages from clients we've never spoken to before. Some of them are referencing the Forbes article directly." Erin added without looking up, 2 acquisition inquiries came in overnight. I nodded once. But I wasn't thinking about expansion. Not in the way they were. I was thinking about perception velocity. How quickly a story can shift once it crosses from private distortion into public verification. At 10:37 a.m., my phone rang again. Unknown number. I answered. A man's voice. "This is Dr. Hayes from Westbridge Media Analysis Group. We're studying narrative correction events in founder ecosystems. Your case has been flagged as statistically significant." I didn't speak immediately. He continued. "We've rarely seen this level of inversion in such a short period of time. Family-generated misrepresentation corrected by institutional publication within 48 hours. It's unusual. Unusual. A word that tried to stay neutral but couldn't fully hide its meaning. And what does that mean?" I asked. "It means your story is now being used as an example of how quickly private narratives collapse under public verification," he said. "We'd like your consent to include anonymized data in our study." I almost smiled. My life, reduced again. This time not by family, but by analysis. "I'll think about it," I said. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment. Because something about that conversation made everything feel even more distant. Not smaller. Just externalized. As if I had been moved from participant to observation point. At 12:18 p.m., I received another message from my mother. I saw the second article preview. I waited. Another message followed. "It makes everything feel irreversible." That word again. Irreversible. As if truth itself had consequences they were only now discovering. I typed a reply, then paused. Because there was nothing left to explain. Nothing left to argue. So I wrote only this. "It was always irreversible. You just didn't see it until now." I sent it. And didn't wait for a response. At 1:44 p.m., Daniel called one last time. "The second piece is performing even higher than expected," he said. "There's something else happening now." "What?" I asked. "Investors are referencing your case in due diligence discussions," he said. "Not as a risk, but as validation of operational independence." I closed my eyes briefly. So even the misrepresentation had turned. Not into correction, but into signal. "I see," I said. There was a pause. Then he added something softer. "You realize this changes your long-term positioning entirely, right?" "Yes," I said. And I meant it. Because it already had. Not in terms of numbers. Not in terms of attention. But in terms of separation. The version of me they had constructed no longer had space to exist in the same system as the version that had been verified. At 3:09 p.m., I walked outside the office alone. The air felt ordinary again. Which was the strangest part. Nothing about the world had changed. And yet everything had. Because now there was no ambiguity left in how I existed in it. At 4:22 p.m., I got one final message from my father. Not a request. Not a correction. Just one sentence. I don't know how to speak to you anymore. I stared at it for a long time. Because for the first time, it didn't feel like control. It felt like distance becoming permanent. And I finally replied. Then don't speak to the version of me you created. Speak to the one that was always here. I sent it. And closed my phone. Because the story was no longer about being believed. It was about what remains when belief is no longer required. And for the first time since everything began, I understood something quietly, without needing anyone else to confirm it. I was not being rewritten anymore. I was simply being seen.